the tales of predatory innovation can seem like I'm selecting specific cases where there would be some kind of a theft or a preying on another company, Facebook and Harvard Connections.com and MySpace or Apple and Xerox, etc., etc. It's possible to understand innovation as something that is always with a predatory component. If you look at the theories of innovations, there are many, but there's a very interesting book that I strongly encourage you to read, which is The Entrepreneurial State by Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana Mazzucato is a very influential academic. She's an economist. She works here in the UK, and she is on the advisory teams of many governments and many political leaders. I recommend you to look at any of her books, not because she's always right, but because she's always insightful. So do go and take a look at The Entrepreneurial State, The Value of Everything. She has many influential and very interesting books. In The Entrepreneurial State, she's looking into innovation and trying to understand where does innovation come from. She does something very interesting in one of the chapters. She looks at the iPhone and she says, where does the technology that is inside an iPhone come from? And let me zoom in a little here so you can see. So her idea is to say, look at the iPhone and look at what's technologically innovative in it. So not just the pretty design, but look at what's inside of it. There's GPS, there's lithium-ion battery, there's a touchscreen, there's a hard drive, there's a microprocessor, and so on and so on. So yes, the design and putting it together is very much Apple's designer, even though we could see influences from elsewhere. But if you look at the technology, actually the technology was designed by other organizations than Apple. And she goes even further and she traces back most of these innovations to public entities, whether it was developed by the military, the Department of Energy, or in universities. So what she shows is that actually in most innovation by private companies, you're going to see a very strong public sector component. If we connect that perspective that the public is financing a lot of technological innovations and scientific innovations that will then be put into private companies' product and services. And if on top of that, you add the fact that most companies, most entrepreneurs get inspired, if not a bit more of a predatory behavior with existing products and competitors, you're starting to see that innovation is actually always within an ecosystem where you cannot just say that one entrepreneur and one company has invented something. You always need to see it in a wider ecosystem. She explains it very, very, very well in a TED talk that she did about the entrepreneurial state that I strongly encourage you to go watch. It's very complete, and within 20 minutes, you have a good introduction to her thinking. She has, in the entrepreneurial state, she has three main points about innovation. First, innovation is collective. Innovation is never carried out by one person in their garage inventing something radically new. Innovation is always something that is done by several people. She's not saying what's the relationship between these people. Maybe these people are collaborating, maybe they're in a competition, maybe they are challenging each other, maybe they are stealing from each other, maybe they are trying to kill the other in the market competition, but it's always collective. It's never just one person. It's always a lot of people working on it. Even within a company, within the same company, people who tell me that Steve Jobs is the one who invented everything at Apple don't understand how a company works. You had designers, you had engineers, you have always a collective behind any kind of innovation. Second aspect it's cumulative. You're never inventing something radically new at one point. You're always inspired, you're always building on, you're always taking from what is existing, what other people are doing, what has been done in other fields. And we've seen with MySpace and how Facebook and Zuckerberg was able to look at MySpace and say, okay, what can we improve? Where can we do different? But not something radically new. We've seen that Steve Jobs went to Xerox and said, okay, what do you have? And they built on it with his team at Apple. So it's always cumulative. You're progressing. So you're not doing nothing, but you're not the only one inventing something alone in your garage or in your cave in the mountain. You're always building up on the accumulation, and then innovation is always cumulative. And the last point, which is key to Mariana Mazzucato's thesis, is that it's uncertain. You don't know where it's going to come from. You don't know what you're going to be able to build on. And it's very important because for her, it's so uncertain that in order to have innovation, you need to have fundamental research that only the public sector is able to finance. So you need to have scientific labs, you need to have universities that are going to build the building blocks for future innovation. So in her perspective, which is quite well documented, in order to have innovation, you need to have a strong state that is going to finance the building block of scientific progress from which private companies and entrepreneurs will be able to take and to elaborate products and services that are seen as innovative and that are successful in the market. So she shows that this idea that innovation is just something carried by private companies is a caricature that doesn't really work when you looked at the facts. To give you a quick example, there was a 3-part documentary about the history of Silicon Valley that was very interesting. But if you read any book that is a bit complete about the history of the Silicon Valley, you will see that there is a Silicon Valley today because you had crazy entrepreneurs in the 70s and the 80s, the Steve Jobs, etc. That's absolutely true. But these entrepreneurs built on something that was existing, and actually the Silicon Valley emerges in the 50s and the 60s with a lot of public contract by NASA and by the Department of Defense, by the military, that was asking private companies to do some research and development and to develop new technologies that could be then used to launch a rocket to go to the moon, to go to space, to build missiles and to build defense systems. So there were this massive influx of public money, plus the presence of a university, of Stanford University, that was very influential, that allowed for these private companies to emerge. So if you want to understand the Silicon Valley today, you have to go all the way back to the 50s and to the public money that was thrown into these private companies, these private enterprises, in order to develop new technologies. From that, you can have entrepreneurs that are going to create Hewlett-Packard, that are going to create Atari, that are going to create a new culture of innovation and of management in the Silicon Valley that is going to give birth to Apple, that is going to give birth later to Google, etc., etc. But actually, the Silicon Valley comes from a very tricky political economy in which public money was put into private ventures in order to create the foundational technology and scientific progress in order to have business innovations that would later be going on the market. But you cannot have one without the other. You cannot have Apple if you don't have Xerox, from which they can steal some ideas. And if you don't have the public funding of the 50s and the 60s to develop the internet, to develop the microprocessor, all of that comes from public universities and public funding of the NASA and of the military. So this is a tricky ecosystem that works very well if you have a circulation of the wealth, the money, the profit that is created. So the public will finance fundamental research in order to have scientific progress and to have technological innovations. And then you're going to have private companies and private entrepreneurs that are going to build new services and products that are going to be successful on the market. The last thing that you need in order for the new fundamental research to be carried by the public is for everyone to pay their taxes. So then you have a state that has public money that can go back into scientific research, into fundamental scientific progress in order to develop new technologies, in order to have new ventures created by private entrepreneurs and companies, etc., etc. So you see, there's a cycle that is drawn by Mariana Mazzucato that is extremely tricky, and it's a very, very tricky balance that goes from public funding of fundamental research all the way to private companies, and then profits, and then taxes, and then public money, and again, and again, and again. As soon as you cut the loop somewhere, you're starting to have progress. Some economists have shown that the rate of innovation has gone massively down in the past 20 years. We always think that we live in an age of innovation because we have a lot of new products, and we think that we see Silicon Valley as the cradle of innovation. But actually, if you look at economists doing studies about this, the Silicon Valley is not the number one place for innovation. It's actually, depending on the ranking, number 3, if not number 5, depending on the metric. Innovation is not that simple idea that an entrepreneur has an idea and then on the Harvard campus or in their garage in the Silicon Valley, they're going to create something new that comes from nowhere. Innovation is always uncertain, it's always collective, and it's always cumulative. So if you have someone who says, I invented something that no one did before, and I'm making a lot of money from it, and I'm going to keep that money and avoid taxes. May I remind you that Elon Musk moved from California to Texas, where his taxes went massively down as a consequence. If you have that, you're starting to have a problem because you're not feeding the loop of innovation by Mazzucato. I encourage you to go see Mazzucato, go watch her TED Talk, go read The Entrepreneurial State and the Value of Everything. It's a great take on innovation, and it's gonna broaden your perspective on innovation if you are not already with that kind of framework in your mind.